Caden Burton, and this year to BrickFair we have the last of what has been a 6-year saga of the Peleliu builds. Next year I'll be starting a new island, so be sure to follow me on Instagram. So this is Bloody Nose Ridge, traditionally known as the Umabrogel Mountains or the Umabrogel Pocket. This is where Colonel Nakagawa had his headquarters. This was the last held Japanese position on the island before the U.S. declared it secure. So at this point in the battle, we're probably like mid-October, late October, and the Marines have encircled the Japanese into the mountain range. There's a lot of really cool things that happen here, a lot of firsts, some records even. So the first of which being that this was one of the first times the U.S. Navy deployed napalm, which turned to be very effective against encaved fortifications along the mountains and the ridges. In real life, these mountains are made of limestone, and so that's where kind of the jagged edge comes from to the very mellowed peaks. So the other thing was the 1st Marine Regiment, along with the 5th and the 7th, ended up here all kind of capturing different objectives. This was the first time in history that the Marine unit was relieved by a Army unit. So the 1st Marine Regiment was pulled off of the line in mid-October and was relieved by the 327th Army Regiment that was transported north from a small atoll called Angaur, which is like 5 miles south of Peleliu. And they would continue the assault here while the 7th Marines, while the 5th Marines would conduct the shortest coast-to-coast amphibious invasion during the war to Ingasibus, which is a small atoll to the northwest of Peleliu, where the Japanese had a artillery emplacement, basically, that had these zeroed in. So to eliminate some of the casualties from the crossfire, they went and cleared out all those artillery guns. So that's the cool history behind it.
Yeah, which is always fascinating with your builds to kind of hear of the actual history behind the battles you depict. So let's dive into the build then, and we can start with kind of the Central Valley section. Talk about kind of the troops and the tanks that you have down here.
Sure. So this is based off of the one reference image that I could find. Objectively speaking, these were known as the 3 Brothers and the 5 Sisters. Those were the code names given to the peaks themselves. So what I'm basically depicting here is the 7th Marines at this point, which is what the unit would be, guided by a small unit of M4A3 Sherman tanks. And they're basically trying to move and capture as much as possible. This was where the Shermans were to a point were equipped with flamethrowers that could shoot up to 75 meters. So they were a lot more effective than sending a guy with an M2 flamethrower up there, especially for some of the ones that are a little bit higher up. The tanks could get up there. So here, objective-wise, reporting back to the CP or wherever, they were recording gaining of space or gaining of mile in a matter of yards. So they weren't moving, inland by miles. They were moving inland by sometimes feet. Because of how bogged down it became due to the machine gun emplacements and all of that. So that was one of the things that the Japanese their mindset changed towards the end of the war was it's a lot less of overwhelm them now with a lot of numbers and more of play the defensive game, inflict as many casualties as possible, and fight to the last man. So that's kind of depicting that main valley. They're trying to push forward as much as they can, clear out as many of those murder holes and those machine gun nests.
And what are the minifigure designs you use there in terms of helmets and torsos and all of that?
So we're still on the Frodo, Lord of the Rings, Hobbit torsos. They're very effective for what I use them for. And then I've, again, done a lot more of the painting stuff for the helmets, the weapons, and all the boots.
Yeah, I love seeing the custom painting. But then that takes us to the rock work as well, which is certainly probably the most impressive part of this build. Do you know how many gray pieces you collected for this?
So based on the long receipts from Bricklink, I'm guessing overall we're somewhere like 64,000 pieces. It's somewhere between that and like 70. But the slopes, the superstructure, a lot of the filler brick, that adds up a lot. So that's where, especially because it's freeform, like there's no burps or lerps in here. It's all individual slopes. So it takes up a good amount of the piece count.
And then what is the internal structure of these two kind of mountain pieces? 'Cause I know you've got spots with soldiers in them.
So the internal is actually almost entirely hollow. The vertical walls on the front all have a engineered superstructure to keep them sturdy by themselves. And then the back wall supports a plate that acts as a spacer. So kind of where it goes from sheer vertical to kind of the mellowed peak, there's a long plate that creates that kind of flow. So all of the filler brick that supports the top holds that there. So, but other than that, the entire inside of it is entirely hollow.
I think that's good save on parts, and it's not too heavy then.
Yeah.
So you also have lights in here, especially looking at kind of like the Japanese troops shooting out from the rocks.
So that's Light My Bricks. They sell a lot of special effects elements, and they have the way that the circuits work are different to kind of how Brick Stuff does theirs. So they have a gun effects, almost like a microchip board, and it has 4 inputs. So each one of the inputs gets placed. Each one of the lights goes into an input, and then the output runs to a expansion board. So you can connect a bunch of things to one thing, and then run a cable from that to a battery box. So each side has 12 inputs that run to a singular battery box in the back, and they all discharge randomly for different durations. So you could get, a 4 or 5 round burst, you could get a 15 round burst, and it's all completely random along each side.
Yeah, and it really adds that nice kind of pop effect to the build as well. Another thing that's interesting that you notice when you first walk up is kind of the perspective of the build. So out front here, the valley is much wider than it is at the far end of the build. So how did you kind of achieve that with the rock work and the overall layout as you approach that?
Well, so when I started this project, I was going to do 4 48 stud base plates, and then I turned into 6. I don't know where in that I ended up on 9, but the idea was I wanted to make it as kind of interesting to look at from the front, because one of the iterations I was going to do was looking at it from the middle to the wall. So you were looking kind of into the wall as opposed to along it. I think I like this layout much better, but I wanted to kind of break up the linear lines. Like this one kind of starts here and goes all the way down. So that one's a little bit cut off on the edge. So there's kind of the makings of an aid station back there, to a sense. And then, yeah, it does kind of close, and I think that's one of the things that I liked when doing the landscape up top, because it all kind of flows down to the middle, where all the craters and most of the troops and stuff are. So from a distance, when you're looking at it, you're actually looking through the valley as opposed to into it. Where if you get up close, you can kind of see the differentiation. But it goes from a spot of I think it's 12 studs down to 2, from end to end. So.
Yeah, I think that kind of perspective change definitely helps add some interest to the build. Another thing I like that you did over here is the explosion on the one cliff side there.
Yeah, that was one of the things, and that's one of the reasons I added the lights, was the sheer amount of dark bluish gray that's here. It's very difficult to pick out small things, especially because you have such light and vibrant with the tan on the bottom, and then you have all these darker colors up top. I wanted to make sure that the orange dish pieces for the machine guns popped out, and there is a hole back there that could have been another one of the machine gun nests. But for that distance, having something that kind of pops out of the build draws the eye back there. And I think it adds just kind of another level of depth when you're looking through it.
And I know you mentioned there was one kind of image that you based this off of. As you're working on a build like this, or your other historical builds you've done, are you reading any personal accounts from the soldiers as well, or is it kind of mostly just photos?
A little bit of both. So one of the standards I kind of hold myself to is historical accuracy. And so the last several years, I've kind of become more and more on tune to sit down and do a lot of research prior to building. And so this one in particular, there's an image I found online that while reading a journal by Sledge, the guy from HBO, he wrote basically his personal account of while he was on Peleliu and Okinawa, that one of the image that I found was in his book, and it showed the names of the cliffs specifically for this area. So that was the big reference picture, and that's one of the things about the Pacific is a lot of reference pictures are either very zoomed out or very targeted. So there's not a lot that give and take when you look at something that you're going to find a picture perfect of exactly what you're trying to recreate. So there is some variance in creativity there with trying to kind of fill in the gaps. But for the most part, it's pretty accurate to what that picture was depicting.
Got it, yeah. Well, it's hard to kind of contextualize things historically sometimes when you're relying on those older records.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that I find fascinating about building World War II is because, there's all the popular battles like Normandy and Stalingrad and other things like that anybody can do, and it's instantly recognizable. And then there's the stuff like this where you may have seen the picture before or recognize the name of the battle, but it's not really something you've seen. And like everyone knows me now as the guy who brings Peleliu builds, but it's kind of become a different thing because everyone kind of walks up and perceives it in a different way. They either like think the rock works really cool or they think the tanks are really cool, and then they read the mock card and they're like, oh, what is that? And then they ask questions, and it just becomes a learning experience. Like that's one of the other reasons that I build stuff like this, because it's not as well known, so people will ask questions, and then the extensive amount of research, I can kind of give them a little bit of a background on what it was, and they walk away having learned something. So.
That's great. So it's an educational experience and a fantastic build. So thank you so much for kind of giving us the whole tour and bringing this out to the show here.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, guys.